to the City Club of Portland Friday Forum. City Club is where we bring civic-minded people together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and play. I'm Karen Curvin, president of City Club, and I would like to welcome members and guests alike, those of you who join us today at Sentinel Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB radio or watching on Portland Community Media. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners ensures we put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank our media partner, Oregon Business Magazine. Our current Friday Forum sponsors are Bank of the Cascades, Family Health Care Plans, Legacy Health, Russell Fellow Properties, The Standard, and Stoll Reeves. We are grateful for your support and commitment to City Club's mission. Please join me in a warm round of applause for all of them. Next week, we have two great after-hour events. On Monday, January 19th at Kells Downtown, we will have an event about universal health care with Senator Dembro, Representative Barbara Smith Warner, and Samuel Metz. On Thursday, the 22nd at Jimmy Mac's, we will talk about innovative solutions to money in politics with former Chief Justice Paul DeMunis, Alan Durning, Executive Director of Sightline, Deb Field, Executive Board Member of Main Street Alliance, and Commissioner Amanda Fritz. That event will be moderated by David Saracen. At next week's Friday Forum, we will discuss systematic approaches to health care with Dr. Leroy Hood, who helped pioneer the Human Genome Program in 1960. You can learn more about City Club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, pdxcityclub.org. As always, we will be live tweeting today's program. You can follow along and join the conversation using the hashtag PDXCityClub. And now to acknowledge the elephant in the room, many of you have heard, and if you haven't, we'll be losing our executive director, Sam Adams, to another organization. You'll be hearing more about our search for a new executive director, and thank you and send off for Sam Adams in the next few weeks, so please watch for that. Our moderator, Jesse Beeson, will facilitate a Q&A session with the audience and our speakers at the end of today's program. Members, please come to the microphone to ask your question. For all of our audience members, please locate the index cards on the center of your tables and write your questions on them during the forum. Hold your cards up high and City Club staff will collect them prior to the start of Q&A. And now for our program. Today is part 2 of our look ahead to the 2015 legislative session. We will hear from racial justice leaders from Center for Intercultural Organizing, Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon, and Urban League of Portland. We will briefly look back at bills that led to progress for communities of color, as well as missed opportunities from the 2013 legislative session. We will focus on 3 legislative initiatives: ban the box, bills to end profiling, and guarantee paid sick leave. Join us today to set the tone for our program is Jen Yerdes Vanderhagen, the director of the Race Program for the Western States Center. Western States Center builds power and connections among community-based organizations and leaders to transform individuals, institutions, and systems to achieve racial, gender, and economic justice. Jen will provide an overview of the report, Facing Race, the 2013 Oregon Legislative Report Card on Racial Equity. Jen?
Hello and thank you. It's an honor to be here today with all of you, and thank you to the Portland City Club for putting this on. My name is Jen Yerdes Vanderhagen, and I'm the Race Program Director. And at Western State Center, like Karen said, we work on economic justice, gender justice, and racial justice. But we believe that it's extremely important to have a sharp point when we talk about racial justice, and that's because we want to ensure that democracy is working for everybody, and we believe that democracy works best when every community in the state is experiencing justice. And so, a little bit about me. I grew up in Corvallis, Oregon. I went to school at the University of Oregon. I've lived up and down the I-5 corridor, and so Oregon really is home for me. And today I'm going to tell you about a changing Oregon and what inspired 8 organizations to come together to develop a racial equity report card that could help our state be stronger. The Racial Equity Report Card is a tool for communities of color to do educational work with their organization's members to talk about the policies and the process that impacts all of their lives. It's also an important tool for accountability for decision makers and legislators in the state. Today, 1 in 5 people is an Oregonian of color. Let me just say that again, 1 in 5. Now, for those of you who have had the privilege of living in Oregon for multiple decades, you might remember that in 1990, 1 in 10 Oregonians was a person of color. And so this is dramatic and quick shifts that we're seeing in our state. And that might sound like a big shift, but I'll tell you, as a young girl who used to stand on her tiptoes to find her mother in a crowded room just looking for dark curly hair, it sure feels like a big shift. We have a lot more people of color in our state, and that's an exciting opportunity. Just so we're all clear, when I say people of color, we're talking about a lot of communities. We're talking about Asian and Pacific Islander communities, the African American community, Latino communities, and Native American communities, as well as mixed race people. And so this diversity, the diversity that exists within those communities is also enormous. Oregon's racial gaps run deep, and they undermine our ability to ensure stable and strong futures with fair opportunities and shared prosperity for all Oregonians. The changing population numbers and stark disparities demand that we pay attention to racial equity. Oregonians of color are twice as likely to face poverty at some point in their lives. Now, that comes from a lot of different things, but we know that Oregonians of color are more likely to be low-wage workers. They're more likely to have less access to health care and access to services that they need. We also know that there's a barrier in education, and that's because 50% of African American and Native American students who are in high school will not graduate by the time that within 4 years, so they will not graduate on time. And while Oregon is making immense strides forward and continuing to make policies to take care of this and to make Oregon schools work for everyone, we know that there are Oregon students of color who are being left behind and falling in the cracks. And that's not a system that's working for any of us, because we need everyone to have that solid foundation. These are just statistics to characterize the very real lived experiences of Oregonians across the state. Like many other states in our country, we're at an important crossroads. As a state, we have the opportunity to embrace our diverse communities, recognizing that it will make all of us stronger in the end. So our legislators in particular have significant power and influence to address racial disparity and racial equity. Both policy and budget decisions that folks make today can either increase opportunity and improve outcomes across lines of race, gender, and economics, or worsen those disparities. Now, many Oregonians actually think that we're just talking about legislators who need to serve their communities in Portland, right? Lots of folks will say, people of color, they live in the urban centers, that might be in Portland. We actually know that that's not true. There are plenty of people of color living in Portland, but some of the counties with the highest percentages of people of color in this state are rural counties. Between 30 and 40% of folks living in some counties are people of color, and that includes Malheur County all the way out in the southeast corner of the state, Marion County right in the center of our state, and Hood River County. So every legislator in the state, every decision maker has a role to play in making these decisions and making outcomes better for communities of color. So that's why we came together to create the Racial Equity Report Card. All of those things informed the need to create a tool that would allow us to do education with our members and to do education with legislators and to hold people accountable. So the 8 organizations that came together to build the Racial Equity Report Card are the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon, Basic Rights Oregon, CAUSA Oregon, the Center for Intercultural Organizing, the Coalition of Communities of Color, Partnership for Safety and Justice, the Urban League of Portland, and Western State Center. And we're not alone. There are about 40 organizations that exist as part of our advisory committee to help us develop the right strategies and plans for this report card. And that's because we believe that every single Oregonian should be represented in this process, and we believe that Oregonians of color come from many different backgrounds and have varied experiences, and we want all of them to be represented in this work. So the goals of the report card are that we want to help legislators understand the need for strong racial equity policy and to promote a rich conversation about what Oregon can and should look like. The report card should also be a tool that shines lights on the ways in which lawmakers and policymakers have made significant gains and identify opportunities for growth and missed opportunities. We've now created 2 racial equity report cards. In the first report card in 2011, we graded both chambers, the House and the Senate. In the second report card, we made the decision, a tough decision, to grade every single legislator. And that was because we wanted to ensure that we could first identify who our champions were and make sure to thank them and work with them on future legislative opportunities. And the second reason was that we wanted to identify who in our legislature wasn't with us quite yet, wasn't all the way there, because we believe that there are opportunities for education and continued conversation to find ways for everyone to play a role in advancing racial equity. So you might be wondering what makes racial equity policy? Because every single policy in the state impacts all people, right? And so we ask ourselves 4 questions. The first is, does it explicitly address racial disparities and work to eliminate racial inequities? The second, will it eliminate barriers to public benefits and institutions for communities of color? Does the legislation advance enfranchisement and full civic participation? And finally, will it protect against racial violence, profiling, and discrimination? We had an extremely successful legislative session in 2013. 18 of the 21 bills that the organizations that come together to develop the Racial Equity Report Card prioritized and worked on passed. So there was a gap, 18 of 21, that's a pretty significant win. Thank you. And yet we know there's a lot of room for growth. We know that every Oregonian can experience the Oregon that we all believe in. And so we left that session with 4 major recommendations for the legislature for the coming sessions. The first is to be explicit about addressing race, both in the conversations that we're having with our colleagues, the ways that we're talking about bills when they're in debate, and also in developing legislation. The second is to implement racial impact statements for bills that are being seriously considered, so that we don't find out later how people of color will be impacted, but so that we have a sense now before we put them into law. The third is to improve government data collection on race and ethnicity for all agencies. We need to know who we're serving, how we're serving them, and how we can improve those services. And then finally, proactively work with communities of color. We all have a role to play in making racial equity a reality in this state, all of us. But legislators have the power and influence to make change that will impact every single person. Policy decisions that they make increase opportunities and outcomes or worsen disparities. And we have a shared fate. This state cannot truly prosper if we are leaving some communities behind. Our future depends on addressing racial equity. Legislators need to be explicit in working to develop and pass policies that will create fairness and equity for all. Yesterday was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, and together we'll all celebrate his legacy on Monday. And yet nationally, conversations about race are still tough to reconcile. We hope that this is one tool that helps bring us together to reconcile those tough conversations and move forward together stronger. I'd now like to introduce to you Jesse Beeson, the Director of Public Policy for the Northwest Health Foundation.
Great. Thank you very much, Jen. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. Moving this way. Kathy Wei is Policy Coordinator for APANO, the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon. Michael Alexander is President and CEO of the Urban League of Portland. And Casey Jama is Executive Director of the Center for Intercultural Organizing. You can learn more about our panelists and their organizations on the City Club website. Also, I should note that our panelists paid me quite a large sum of money to make sure I noted that their organizations do not work alone. They work in alliances and coalitions with many more organizations to affect change on the topics that we'll cover today. Our panelists may mention them, and I'm sure that many of them are live tweeting right now. Today, our panelists will focus on 3 legislative initiatives they're helping to spearhead. So to kick us off, I've asked our panelists to spend 2 minutes summarizing their bills, and then we'll move right into our discussion. And I want to dive in with a topic we covered with the legislators who joined us at our forum last month, and that's paid sick days. Kathy, what are the key parts in the paid sick days bill?
Well, first of all, thank you, Jesse, and thank you to the City Club of Portland for having myself and APANO and many other organizations that we work with up here to talk about some of our key priority issues for the upcoming legislative session. So I'm sure many of you are already aware of the Portland and Eugene paid sick days ordinances that passed. And what this statewide bill would do is essentially allow employers to grant and implement a paid sick days law, basically, for all of their employees. So now how that would happen is that accrual of sick time will begin after 90 days of employment, and after every 30 hours work, the employer will get an hour's work of paid sick time. And so there's a couple of different specifics as to how that could go with the employer, but we are just really confident that because it passed in Portland and Eugene, that this is widely supported by many different groups and organizations. And I will dig deep into further details as we move forward.
Great, thank you, Kathy. Let's stay on this theme of employment. Michael, the bill the Urban League and other organizations are supporting is nicknamed Ban the Box. Can you fill us in on what Ban the Box would do?
Ban the Box would address the concern that many of us have regarding the barriers to employment that many individuals who have criminal histories face. 32,000 individuals within the state of Oregon are under the supervision of the Department of Correction, whether they're institutionalized or under community supervision. Upon discharge, upwards of 75% of those individuals are unable to find employment regardless of the nature of their offense or the efforts that they have undertaken in terms of rehabilitation and successful reentry. This relegates these folks to second-class citizenship, and in many ways, it's double jeopardy. It also creates unnecessary barriers on employers in terms of being able to find talent that they need. The Ban the Box legislation would, in fact, require that employers remove the requests for information around criminal history from the application process and have that information become available later on, hopefully in the course of an interview, but later on in the process.
Great, thank you, Michael. Casey, your bill tries to address criminal justice from the other side, and that is racial profiling by law enforcement. Can you summarize what changes you want to see made in Salem?
Well, thank you, Jesse, and thank you very much for the City Club for having us. I think before I start, let me tell you, I came to this state about 16 years ago, and as a new Oregonian, you might wonder, why do I have to do anything about or care about profiling? As you know, in this country, this summer, we struggle, a lot of us, in terms of what profiling and police accountability means to us, as the killing of Michael Brown and Eric Garner and others came to life in our televisions and our networks. This is a national phenomenon. This is a national issue, but it also impacts us Oregonians. We have to address the problem. There is no question about the people of color, immigrant refugees, others, Native American, Latinos, LGBTQ community face some sort of way of profiling. It's time as a state, as a nation, that we have to come together and address this issue. CIO, Center for Intercultural Organizing, and many of our partners are addressing and pushing 3 fundamental bills that we believe that will have impact, although might not end profiling. The first bill will define profiling and will prohibit law enforcement agencies solely relying on someone's race, language, housing status, sexual orientation, gender, identity as basis to stop someone. The next bill, it will be a bill that will collect data. We know that if we don't have the data, we don't understand what we are dealing with. It will give the state's attorney general the authority to collect complaints about profiling by law enforcement residing in Oregon. The last bill will also address the issues of data collection. The law enforcement will report to their stops and individual belonging to one of the main protected class that I mentioned. So those are the 3 major areas that we believe. But at the end of the day, we believe profiling, as a community, we have to work together to stop and end profiling.
Thank you, Casey. Michael, you said Ban the Box would help eliminate barriers for employers, but how is it not making it harder for employers to go through the hiring process?
You know, I think, hopefully this is live. Okay, great. I think one of the things that I want to underscore to employers is that the summarial discharge of individuals who have criminal histories from even an application creates an artificially smaller pool of qualified candidates for them to interview. We know that many of these folks are individuals who are able to demonstrate that they are on a path to rehabilitation and that they are also able to be contributors. We also know that there's a disproportionate impact on communities of color. You know, African Americans are 2% of the state. They're roughly 12% of the individuals who are represented within this. As we look at unemployment statistics, this is another barrier that continues to place greater disparate impact on unemployment within our community. Employers in this legislation would not be prohibited from asking about criminal backgrounds. They would not be prohibited from placing individuals in positions where there are restrictions against certain types of criminal backgrounds and safety-sensitive positions. And they would not be forced to hire anyone who they didn't want to hire. What we're asking is that everyone be given the opportunity to have their qualifications looked at along with their history. And if the box is checked early in the process, that rarely happens. The National Labor Employment Project did a survey of employers. 66% of them admitted when they saw the box checked, they just moved on to the next applicant. And that had nothing to do with the nature of the offense. It had nothing to do with its impact on the type of work that they were applying for. And in many instances, it meant that individuals who had the opportunity to become tax contributors were now going to continue to be a drain on community and the state and employers as a whole.
Thank you. Kathy, I want to ask you a similar question. How does paid sick days not make it harder for employers to hire? Or in other words, how does this bill actually a good thing for business in Oregon?
So right now, we know that there are 130,000 people of color who don't have access to any type of paid sick time on the job. And slightly less than half, so about 47% of total Oregonians working in the private sector do not have any type of paid sick time. And so, we know that when we look at folks who don't get paid sick time, they are more likely to be single parents, heading households with children. They tend to be folks of color, as I mentioned before, and they also tend to be folks who are low-wage workers. So when we think about the economy and the economic recession and what that did for our workforce, it has created larger barriers for folks who are trying to get out of the recession, who are trying to, climb up the steps out of poverty. Without having paid sick time, it makes it harder for them to keep a job because a lot of these folks are fearful that if they have to stay at home to take care of a sick child with a cold, for example, that their employer may fire them. And so by not having sick time, it's not good for our economy because there is a whole class of folks, as I said before, low-wage workers in particular, who are sometimes the backbone, right, of a lot of our services and our industries who don't have this basic benefit and right. And so if an employer doesn't give them at least the minimum amount of what is requested, then it affects all of us, and it affects some of the hardest working Oregonians here in the state, who are in our restaurant industries, who are in our cleaning services and landscaping jobs, as an example.
Thank you. Casey, you mentioned how profiling is really in the national conversation right now. But I'm wondering if you know where Oregonians are at when it comes to this issue.
Well, let me first say this. As a state, Oregon never fired one single law enforcement officer for killing a person of color. We have no statute that defines what profiling means. Each agency is left to its own terms to determine how they're going to collect the data and how they're going to address issues of profiling. I think I remember the question for me. I had a long conversation a while back. Our former police chief, Chief Sizer, who we used to sit and have a coffee together. And I think one of the questions we used to talk about is whether this profiling exists or does not exist. And I think a lot of times people, law enforcement agencies say it's a perception. It's not real. And I think as a community of color, immigrant refugee, we know that that's not the reality we face. So in Oregon, it's actually an issue for Oregonians. We get complaints across the state. My agency, as I sit in my office, many community members walk into our offices sharing their experience. Just last Sunday, 11 o'clock at night, I get a call, one of my board members, Sharif, who lives in Beaverton, 11 o'clock, and he just said, I just been profiled. And I think those kind of conversations, it's happening statewide, profiling is happening statewide, but this is an issue of Oregon. Let me give you an example, another statistics. According to the article that's published by the Scanner, from January 2010 to 2014, there has been 101 deadly force used by the law enforcement agencies, and that includes 92 shootings that resulted 43 deaths. And those statistics, 22 only happened in Portland. Rest of them was across the state. So this issue, although people seem to be sometimes conceived it's only happening northeast Portland, this is a statewide issue, and we have to approach and address this as a statewide phenomenon.
Thank you. Michael, the economy in Oregon is getting better, as we've seen from a lot of recent data. So won't people with previous convictions benefit and naturally find employment as a result?
I think we would hope that that would be the case, but so far the data has shown us that there continues to be significant disparities between the employment rate gains of communities of color and ex-offenders and the recovery. We know in many instances that employment practices will still follow the patterns that had been exhibited prior to the recession. And at that point, as I said, upwards of 75% of these individuals with criminal histories were unemployed. And you know, one of the things that I will say is, as a taxpayer, all of us are contributing into programs and efforts to provide training and rehabilitation services for individuals in the penal system. I will fully admit that recidivism exists. I will fully admit that there will be individuals who come out of that system who go right back in. But the box on an application does not distinguish between that individual and the person who is successfully invested in their future, who has made a successful transition back into the community, who is working to realign with community interest and families and business interest, who's done everything that we have asked them to do to navigate back to the path of righteousness. The box doesn't differentiate between those two. Dialogue does. And that's what we're asking.
Thank you. Casey, at our legislative preview forum last month, right here on this stage, Representative Val Hoyle shared the experience of a community in New Jersey and made the argument that local policing changes were perhaps more important to ending racial profiling, not necessarily passing a law to outlaw it. In fact, she said maybe it would make folks feel better, but questioned if it would actually make a difference on the ground. And she's not the only one saying that. So why is outlawing the practice needed?
I think it's an important question, and I think the reality is that we cannot regulate culture. We cannot regulate how individual person's beliefs and ingrained history of where they come from. We cannot regulate that. What we can regulate is how our systems and law enforcement agencies behave or conduct their business or their policing. There's no question about that. Police bias is an issue. What we can do is ensure that people, when they feel that they have been profiled, one, there's a mechanism that they can complain, and that complaint, there's a statewide system that processes that complaint, and so people believe that they can, there is accountability. The second piece of the issue is that we have to ensure that our law enforcement agencies have the definition what is profiling is and what they can and cannot do in terms of, and so they have to have a clear understanding what that means. So for me, the issue is that what I said earlier is that creating and trying to define culture, it's a one thing, but really holding the system is accountable, it's due. So we need that system. We have to have accountability in our system, and we have to ensure that our community members feels that they enjoy the full protection of the law. That's really what we are after, and that's what we are advocating as an agency, and that's what we're advocating as a coalition.
Thank you. So also at last month's forum, Kathy, this question is for you. Senator Steiner Hayward noted that for her, this was a public health issue. She's a physician. She really saw this as public health. I'm wondering what other kinds of sector support are you seeing around paid sick days?
Well, that's a great question. So, yes, this is definitely a public health issue. workers, if they are sick, should stay at home and not spread any other sicknesses or illnesses to other people. Other sectors that are in support of this is obviously those in the labor movement, of course, as well as a lot of businesses, actually, for some of the reasons that I had stated earlier about, about just strengthening our workforce and making sure that they are keeping the best people in their jobs and they're not losing them due to, due to a sickness that progressively becomes worse because they don't have something implemented in their policies to give folks the right amount of time off. So I would say the business community, obviously we are a part of a huge coalition that actually went public called the Fair Shot Coalition, and it's a lot of our faith, labor, community-based organizations, community leaders who are really in full support of this issue. So we have a full coalition of folks who want to see this happen for all parts of Oregon.
And what do you see as the prospects of this happening in this session?
I believe that we are really hopeful that this is going to be, obviously a huge issue, number one, but I think we have really good support from a lot of our key electeds and a couple of the legislatures that we've talked to around this issue. And as I was saying before, we have a big coalition that Apano and some of these other organizations are also a part of to help move this agenda. And I also want to mention that on the public health lens, we are also a part of the Oregon Health Equity Alliance, which is made up of community-based organizations and other groups that are looking at decreasing health disparities.
Great. So, Michael, some of the same criticisms lobbed at the racial profiling bills could be lobbed at Ban the Box, right? Just getting rid of the box doesn't solve the problem. So I'm wondering, what else could we be doing as a state that really focuses on improving the job prospects for people with prior convictions?
Well, I think that it clearly is a pervasive barrier to employment, but it is not the only one. We will look at a number of the other bills that are in front of us and in front of the legislature to look at what are some of the upstream impacts. Obviously, the focus on education and addressing educational disparities begins to avoid what many of us refer to as the school-to-prison pipeline, which is disproportionately populated by children from communities of color. We also need to understand that there are states that have faced this issue and are much farther along the path to solution than Oregon is. As much as we pride ourselves on our progressivism, there are 13 states that have passed ban-the-box legislation or ordinances. 70 cities and counties have also done it, including the city of Portland and Multnomah County in their own hiring practices. So I think there's a lot that we can do if we can look to places where we believe better practices have already begun to emerge, and what are the other issues that circulate around avoiding this permanent population of second-class citizens.
Thank you. So, Casey, if I understand, you all did public polling around this issue of racial profiling. Can you tell us what Oregonians are saying about it?
Sure. From December 3rd to December 18, a group, GBA Strategy, conducted polling on behalf of the Fair Shot campaign, which CIO is part of that coalition also. And we want to wonder what the Oregonians think about when it comes to the law enforcement relying on profiling for their policing. And the question, we ask is that the Oregonians are, where do you think that the law enforcement agencies rely on profiling people based on, race, gender, sexual orientation, so forth and so on? And the polling was about 1,000 likely voters for 2016 for Oregonian voters. What that result show us that actually Oregonians are fair-minded people. They do not want people to be profiled based off what I said. So 85% of the Oregonians overall said agree with us. If I give you a little bit more into the depth of what folks said in different areas, in Eugene area, for example, 85% said yes, we agree law enforcement should not be relying on profiling. In Southern Oregon, it's 87%. Cascade and Eastern is 78%. In terms of the party affiliation, 90% of Democrats agree with us. Republicans, 78% of us agree with us. So what that shows is that there is actually, the Oregonians are giving the legislatures a mandate saying that we need to end this. We have to solve this issue once and for all. And again, so that's one of the reasons. It just shows that there's a statewide support on this issue as we move forward 2015 legislation session.
Thank you. Casey, Michael mentioned that 13 states have already banned the box. Do you know if other states have taken the steps that you seek to take to end profiling?
Yes, so there's several states who have addressed this issue. I think the first one that we started looking into was state of New Mexico that also did pass the profiling. I do believe Nebraska actually did ban profiling. So there is actually a national efforts that moving on. Other states are trying to do the same thing that we're trying to do because, as I said earlier, this is a really historic issue, but this is also right everyone's in mind right now, and that's one of the reasons that we are pushing forward.
And Kathy, do you know of any other states that have attempted to do this?
Yes, and I'm sort of referring back to my notes to this specific question because I can't remember off the top of my head, but Oregon will definitely will not be the first state to have a full paid sick days law. And I will also say that the Eugene law that passed last year is actually quite the gold standard of a paid sick days, any type of paid sick days legislation. And a lot of other states are actually looking into our example in Eugene as, as something to look forward to in building, addressing these issues around workers and also employers and paid sick time. And so Eugene is a pretty gold standard when it comes to across the country.
And so with yesterday's announcement that President Obama would also like to pursue national paid sick leave, is it time to just maybe hit the pause button on this in Oregon?
I think we're going to continue with the work that we have already started in Oregon and not wait for, our federal government to, catch up to us. So we are, already obviously trailblazing and go Blazers, but we're also basically trailblazing this movement here in Oregon. And as I was saying before, we have very, very different demographics here in Oregon as it was 10 years ago. In fact, the Asian and Pacific Islander communities here in this state grew by 50% from the 2000 to 2010 census. And so we know that the state is growing in demographics, in diversity, and this is a real opportunity for us, as Oregonians to look at our economy and to find ways that we can strengthen not just one group of people, but multiple sectors of our workforce.
So you all wrote me a big check to mention that you all work with a lot of supporters. But I'm wondering who's opposing each of your bills? Who are the main sectors who are not excited about seeing this happen in Oregon? Let's start with Casey.
So I think the important thing is to say is that as far as we know at this point, we are not aware anyone who is actually opposing. I think most of the conversation is that we're having with folks both in the state capital as well as the local organizations and community members. Every one of us is helpful. What can we do to support? Let me give you an example. I think, a few months ago, during the summer, we started having a conversation with Sheriff Pat Garrett in Washington County, and we were talking about this issue, and we let him know that the issue is happening in his community, and his response was that, well, let me see it, what I can do. And a few months later, he came back to me and said, you know what, I'm going to implement my own data collection so I can understand what I am dealing with. And I do believe right now he is actually collecting the data. So I think this issue has a much broader support, but I have to admit it. I mean, 2013 was a different scenario. We were really having a tough time to even talk to the legislators about this issue. So I think because of what's happening at national level, and it's just, I think we feel like this is the right time, and I think as Oregonians, we have to come together and support this issue pushing forward. So there's a huge support.
Thank you. Michael.
You know, I've spent 25 years in the private sector, and I know that anytime there is a mandated change in how businesses conduct their normal routine processes, it in many ways feels like an unfunded mandate. I would say that the opposition is hard for me to identify in terms of who. I think it's what we're asking employers to do. But I also know that upwards of 95% of all large organizations now conduct background checks, and we're essentially saying rely on the background checks. I mean, use the information that will provide. It will point out the distinction between someone you need to have concern about and someone you don't need to have concern about. So rather than look at this as somebody imposing a standard on how you conduct your business, it's someone who is encouraging you to take greater advantage of a resource and an information source that many people are already using.
Great, thank you. Kathy?
So I also would have to agree that I don't think there's, a clear opposition to what we're proposing right now statewide. And in fact, I actually just took a look at my notes, and Oregon would be the 4th state in the country to pass a paid sick days statewide law if this were to go into effect. And so that's really exciting. And there are also 15 other cities across the nation with this type of bill. And so I think for us, it would be, a matter of I think it would be more on the employer's end to question more of the specifics around, if they were to implement this, how would they look? How would it look like? How would it affect the current benefits that they already are giving to their workers? And so what we've been hearing is that a lot of Oregonians, want something that is of more benefit, around paid sick time leave. And so we know that we have a huge support base in favor of this. So I think the only, issues that would be coming up is basically for the employers, and depending on whether they have 5 employees to 30 employees, that would be an issue that would, come about.
Great, thank you. So we are now going to open up to the Q&A portion of our program. So for folks in the audience, if you've written a question on the index card, please hold it up high so City Club staff can come and collect that. And we'll now take questions from the audience. As always, we invite members to the microphone to ask their question. Please know that asking questions at the Friday Forum microphone is a benefit of City Club membership, and membership is open to everyone. Before asking your question, please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask your question in 30 seconds or less, or I will cut you off. And hopefully we'll have time for just one index card question. Please, your question.
Wynn Wakala, City Club member. I know part of the important thing as far as racial profiling goes is to have a more diverse workforce with the police. And when we're kind of putting down the police, the question is, how do you get people of color to want to be police officers? And then I have another question too for Michael. When it comes to even finding a job, and I know from my own experience, I have such an odd name, When I tried to work for private industry, I'm sure my resume just ended up in the round file. How do you encourage private employers to even interview someone with an odd name or a different name?
So I'm going to ask for one answer, just to be fair. Casey, do you want to answer that first question?
I think diversifying law enforcement, it's important issue. But the reality is that we know that it's not going to end profiling. It's one part of the equation that we need to address and diversify in our forces. And I think also important to know that the police officer is we need to actually recruit people where they live. Let me give you an example right now. 70% of the police officers who are serving in city of Portland live outside of city of Portland. And that's really important issue to underline and highlight. So not only do we need to diversify our law enforcement agencies, but we also need to hire within the community and recruit within the community where people live. And that's one way we can actually change this practice also.
Next question.
Hi, Walter, City Club member. My question is for Michael Alexander. How will Ban the Box change the access for rehabilitated individuals in the realms of housing and public resources?
Our focus here today has largely been on employment, but the reality is that we know the most effective tools to address recidivism are a job and a place to live. There have been parallel efforts, particularly in Salem, to address some of the barriers to housing, and we will continue to advance those as well. We didn't necessarily want to sort of link them together because in some ways, while they're similar, the mitigation strategies would be somewhat different, as with the target audiences. But I underscore the importance that making sure people have access to housing where they want to live and how they want to live is going to be equally important as making sure that they can be gainfully employed.
Thank you. Next question.
Could Jeff Strang, City Club member, could any of you comment on the racial equity implications of Common Ground Oregon-Washington's legislation to establish a dividend for Oregon residents, like the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend, funded by an annual fee on private ownership of land, to more widely share the inherited white privilege of land ownership dating back through redlining and internment to the Donation Land Act of 1850 and the conquering of Native American territory?
All right. Don't all grab your mic at once. I'm looking for volunteers.
I'm not prepared to answer it, and I will say, however, that we will hear many things about approaches that we need to take to rectify past injustices, whether it's reparations or others, because many of us work in organizations or support systems that were designed to operate very differently than the people who they serve today. I'm not in a position to speak specifically. However, I would never discourage us looking to find ways of unpacking some of the injustices that exist in our history and not simply saying we live in 2015, so let's ignore what was created in 1850. It doesn't work that way. Stories don't get started in the middle. So while I can't speak specifically, thematically, I think we're going to have to continue to challenge these injustices, historical and systemic, in any way that we can.
Next question.
Carol Witherell, City Club. Thank you so much. Personally, I've come to see the issues that you've described of racial and economic and sexual orientation injustices and inequities as the civil rights movement of the 21st century. And we're either in it or we're all going to bust apart. So that's a prelude. But my question is, how might all citizens participate in the rising momentum around the nation and in their own city and region that is on the heels of Ferguson that's symbolized by the film premiered last night at the Witzel Auditorium titled Arresting Violence, Arresting Power, Police Violence in Portland, Oregon, and the forums that are springing up all around our region. How can we make use of those, access them, get involved, and really dismantle the new Jim Crow and all the other unjust, inequitable programs that are keeping us apart?
I'm going to ask all of you to answer how one can get involved in your particular initiatives, and if you want to take the larger question, please do.
Well, thank you. So I think the question is that, it's important to understand we all need to get involved. I think as a refugee, former refugee, and also now United States citizen, I do believe that we need to exercise and participate in our democracy. That's only one way we can demand change, and so involvement is important. So our organization, for example, this summer, when we travel across the state and we ask people what they think about profiling and how they can get involved. And currently, right now, we actually scheduled 3 forums, statewide forums, one in Eugene, January 23rd, and one in Portland, January 26th, and another one in Medford, February 1st. And so we're addressing this issue as a statewide issue. And what we are hoping to do is that even though if we pass, as I said earlier, profiling bills, it's not going to end profiling. So we have to create a pathways people to continue to work on this issue. And as Oregonians, we have to change our narrative, and we have to work together collectively in order to create a just society. So it depends all of us get involved.
I concur with my colleague, and I would say that on an individual basis, when we ask ourselves why we should care about some of these inequities, I would say each of us has to ask ourselves, why shouldn't we care? And the area that I try to underscore when I have the opportunity to speak to people is to start with a hard and fast look at how your life has not been impacted by barriers that impact others. Take 15 minutes, go online, Google the Harvard implicit bias test, and do some internal soul searching as to how unconscious biases affect your thinking, and how privilege that you are afforded removes barrier from your life that others face every day. I tell people I have 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. My daughter, I love my boys, I adore my daughter. She is my best student, she is my best athlete, and she will never have the privilege that her brothers are afforded on a day-to-day basis. And it doesn't mean that her brothers are bad folks. They did not ask for that privilege, they were given it. What they do with it is what will determine the value of their lives and the integrity that they bring to each day. I would charge everyone in this audience and everyone who will hear this to know that you are charged in the same way. Many of us are afforded privilege. Many of us believe that we didn't ask for it, so therefore we can't be held accountable for others who don't have it. It's just not true. That's where the work starts.
And I'd like to piggyback on both Casey and Michael's comments very quickly and say that in the beginning, Jen referenced the Racial Equity Report Card and how this will be the second publication of this really valuable tool that all of us as policymakers, community leaders, folks who work with diverse communities can essentially look at this tool to also help inform the decisions that we're making in our own workplaces, in our own communities. And so I think, that would also be a great way for folks here in the room to get involved and get engaged. And then the second piece I would add on is to try to, understand and learn from history, but also from many of our histories, because they're all interconnected and interwoven. And I just say that on Apano's behalf, because oftentimes many of our Asian and Pacific Islander issues don't get addressed. And so, we have been working towards civil rights and immigrant rights and workers' issues for many, many years now here in Oregon. And many of our folks, you know, early on in the 1800s were brought over here to work on sugarcane plantations and our railroads. And when I say that history to someone who's not as knowledgeable, we just connect and we talk about deeper issues. So I would, you know, encourage everyone here, if you're unfamiliar with any topic or issue, please ask, please research, and check out our websites at all of our organizations. We can provide that information to you.
Great. We may have time for one more question from the audience. Yes,
Thank
we
you.
do.
Paul Milius, club member. Does anybody keep statistics on the proclivities of officers of color? Do they also profile? If not, do we have any information? If they do, what do we know about that?
I will defer to my colleague, but the question, I'm going to reject the premise, and in a respectful way. I will tell you that in New York City, after the recent tragedies of those 2 police officers who were killed, the Black Policemen's Benevolent Association publicly said that many of their members were frightened to now be driving around because, 1, they believed that they were going to be profiled because of the heightened anxiety, and 2, they had weapons, and that their weapon might be visible before their badge was. And so I think in some ways we can say that this is a behavior, but this is a behavior that is rooted in the concerns that we have about how people of color are portrayed and how people are socialized to believe who they are, what they're capable of, or what their lives may or may not be worth.
But my question was, does anyone keep those statistics, and what do they tell us?
I think I'm going to concur with what Michael Alexander said. I think the reality is that I think there is a notion of your question that inherently says that somehow, you know, there's equal opportunity for law enforcement agencies, officers to profile. We know this issue is a systematic issue based of people being perceived, profiled by race. We know that even law enforcement officers who are Black are actually even killed, as recently in New York, because simply they were, simply they were Black and perceived to be, So to me, the question is, it's a systematic, of course, a systematic issue, but it's a real issues based of race, gender, sexual orientation, people who have been perceived others. That is really what the heart of the issue is. So I think for me, I'm going to also reject the premises of the question.
We have run out of broadcast time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. Copies of the Racial Equity Scorecard or report card are available in the back of the room and are also available at Western State Center website. As we close for today, please join me in offering our sincere thanks to Friday Forum Committee members Bobby Reagan and Andrea Miller, who produced today's program, and our speakers, Jen Yeris Vanderhagen, Jesse Beeson, Michael Alexander, Kathy Way, and Casey Jama. Thank you.